The cheap Hotel Arda, faded watercolor of a stream crossing under an old log bridge hung crooked above the bed. Outside the window, the orange light of a late autumn sun was folding itself over the jagged horizon of the Great Smoky Mountains. The clock on the nightstand read 7:12 p.m. Akari Tanaka sat on the edge of the mattress, her phone gripped in both hands like a relic. She wasn't texting. She wasn't scrolling. She wasn't calling. She was just holding it, staring down at the dark screen the way one might regard a sealed letter from a battlefield, something you need to open but can't bear to read. 15 minutes late. That was all. In the world she and her husband Kaido had built a world of carabiners, compass, bearings, and quiet competence. 15 minutes was nothing. A gust of wind could add 15 minutes. Curious toddler mesmerized by an anthill could add 30. A real wrong turner was an hour. An injury, 2, maybe more. But this wasn't that. This wasn't a slip-up or a scheduling mistake. This was something else. The plan had been precise. It always was. A one-day hike along the Bent Ridge trailhead, a moderately strenuous route Kaido had walked half a dozen times. They'd mapped it out together, sprawled across their kitchen floor. Luna crawling between topographic maps and energy bar wrappers. Kaido had wanted to take their daughter, 14 months old, endlessly curious on her first true backcountry. Experience nothing too difficult. No river crossings, no extreme grades, but deep enough to hear the quiet. Real quiet. The kind that pressed into your ears and asked if you were listening. Akari had almost said no. Not because she didn't trust him. Kaido was the most meticulous person she knew, but because there was always a sliver of risk in the woods, even with the gear, even with the knowledge. The forest didn't care how many fire-starting methods you knew or whether your map had been laminated, but Luna had been so excited. Rather, Luna had absorbed her father's excitement like a sponge. When Kaido crouched down to show her how to adjust the red baby carrier straps, she clapped. He clipped the orange whistle to her jacket. She giggled. She didn't know what the Smokies were, but she knew she was going somewhere with Daddy. That had been yesterday morning, Saturday, October 5th, 2018. He had promised to return to the hotel by 7 p.m. Just in time for dinner and bedtime. He had not returned. The Subaru was still in. The lot unlocked. Neat. The way he always left it, Akari waited until 8:35 p.m. before she made the call. Her voice was calm when she spoke to the dispatcher. Years of wilderness experience had trained her to suppress panic. She gave the names Kito Tanaka, 34, Luna Tanaka, 14 months. Description of gear, intended trail, last known message, which she forwarded by text. The message was simple, a photo. A few seconds of video and one line of text. The mountains are showing off today. Love you. Kaido's face was sunlit and open, his expression relaxed. He was wearing the green beanie she'd knitted last winter and the neck gaiter he always packed, even in mild weather. Behind him, the forest was alive with gold and fire-orange foliage. On his back, nestled inside the red carrier, Luna's tiny face peeked out from beneath her pale sun hat. Her eyes, wide and curious, seemed to study the camera itself. They looked perfect, untouched by fear, untouched by finality. The moment would become iconic. The search effort launched before dawn at the Sugarlands Ranger Station. The report landed in front of Ranger Valerius Ash, veteran of 29 years, with a face like worn sandstone and a voice that rarely needed to rise above a murmur. He didn't get rattled, but the word toddler and a missing persons report always twisted something inside him. He stared at the image of Kaido and Luna. On his screen for a long time before closing the file, the clock had started. They always said. The first 24 hours were critical, but Ash knew better. Out here it was the first 12, because the Smokies didn't wait by 6 a.m. Helicopters were in the air. The forest swallowed the sound within seconds. On the ground, teams moved with precision. Trained volunteers, SAR units, K-9 teams, bright jackets in red and yellow, radios clipped to harnesses, eyes scanning every patch of disturbed soil, every broken branch, every out-of-place object. But there was nothing. No boot prints, no shredded fabric, no dropped bottle or wrapper. No baby sock caught on a twig, nothing. It was as if the forest had pulled a curtain behind them. Ash didn't like it. He had seen hundreds of search cases. Most ended in confusion, sometimes tragedy, but they followed a rhythm. There were signs, always. This had none. On the third day, a volunteer team was bushwhacking through a steep draw half a mile off the main trail when one of them retired. Engineer named Marcus slipped on a mossy root and reached out to brace himself. His hand closed on something cold, something solid. He knelt and uncovered a brass compass. Old, cracked, needle frozen. A relic. Not a tool, but it was something. The find generated a spike of hope that pulsed through the command post like caffeine. Ash studied it under the lamp in his office. Ornate, unusual. Could have been his, someone offered. For GPS? Maybe Kaido was old school? Maybe he carried one as a failsafe? Or maybe not. Ash stared at it a long time. Eventually, he placed it in a Ziploc, labeled it, and wrote, unconfirmed. Possible marker. No. ID by day 6, the national news had picked up the story. Missing survivalist father. Missing baby girl. Silence from the wilderness. People had theories. Most didn't hold water, but one whispered through the forums and Facebook. Pages and podcast comments. Stuck. What if he didn't get lost? What if Kaido had planned it? What if he'd walked into the mountains with the full intention of never coming back? It wasn't an original theory. Not in Appalachia. There were stories going back decades. People who vanished into the hollows. Who lived off-grid. Built cabins under pine canopies. Disappeared by choice. It was fiction. AKR. I knew it. Kaido was no escapist. He wasn't chasing some Thoreauvian fantasy. He loved their life, loved their daughter, loved her. She could see it in the footage. Hear it in his voice as he pointed out deer tracks to Luna. She knew the cadence of sincerity, but public perception has its own current. It carried them, eventually. The official search effort began to scale down. Volunteers left. News vans vanished. The forest resumed its slow and different breathing. Only Akari remained. Every weekend, she returned. Parked at trailheads, marked maps, hiked old paths. Alone, sometimes she cried. Sometimes she didn't, but she always walked. Not for Kaido, not anymore. She knew what likely lay in some moss-covered hollow. Or halfway down a hidden ravine, she walked. For Luna, because there was one impossible sliver of possibility that she refused to let go of. If her baby was still alive, somewhere somehow Akari would not stop. Not until the forest gave her back, or told her why it wouldn't. The backpack was red. It was the first thing that caught Sarah Jenkins' eye. She stood on a precarious ledge 20 feet above the forest floor. The late afternoon sun reflecting off the granite wall behind her. Her climbing harness creaked slightly as she shifted her weight. She'd been scanning the rocky terrain for mineral striations. Faint changes in hue that might signal deposits of feldspar or quartz, but this wasn't quartz. This wasn't rock at all. It was fabric, torn in one place. Sun-faded, but unmistakably red. Ben, she called, pointing toward the shadowy cleft between two huge boulders. You see that? Ben Carter, her research partner and fellow geology grad student, was about 30 feet below, wedged between a cluster of jagged rock outcrops with a heavy sampling bag on his hip. He looked up, squinting. Yeah, looks like trash. It's maybe a jacket. Sarah shook her head. No, it's deeper than that. It's wedged in. Leave it, he said. We're losing light. But she didn't. Something about it wasn't just the color, or the shape, or even the way it sat jammed into the fissure. Was the wrong kind of thing to be here. Not just unusual. It's plausible. They weren't on a trail. Hell, they weren't. Even in the vicinity of a trail. Their research site was in a rarely accessed portion of the Great Smoky Mountains, high up near a granite dome that the park maps labeled only by contour lines and survey markers. No names, no foot traffic. Number. Casual campers. Spare stone, loose shale, and scrubby laurel, clinging to life in shallow crevices. Geology didn't care for crowds. And Sarah had come to appreciate that. She clipped a rope into the nearest anchor bolt and rappelled down the sharp angle of the rock face, boots skimming the slope until she reached a narrow ledge above the cleft. From here, the red object was visible, a dense bundle of nylon wedged tight between two massive slabs. Ben joined her after a moment, slightly annoyed but curious. His face changed when he got closer. "That's not a jacket," he muttered. "Is that a baby carrier?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. She crouched, reaching toward it cautiously, fingers brushing dirt and small flecks of broken twigs. It was indeed a child carrier, the high-end, structured kind used by serious hiking parents. Thickly padded shoulder straps, a rigid frame, faded brand tag. The red was dulled, but not bleached. The buckles were scratched but intact, and the pack was heavy, not just soaked with rain heavy. Whoa, 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 with something inside. Ben ran a hand over his face. What the hell is this doing here? That was the question. It was wedged into the fissure with force, like it had been jammed in deliberately, or more likely deposited by something stronger than gravity. It took nearly an hour to get it out. They rigged a belay and used a makeshift sling to hoist it gently free from the stone. Every inch it moved sounded like sandpaper against bone. Eventually, it came loose with a jolt that nearly knocked Sarah backward. When they finally got it up onto the ledge, they sat in silence, staring. No body. No blood, no sign of violence, but it was real, tangible, human, and impossibly out of place. They carried it with them, the burden awkward and unfamiliar, heavier than their own gear. The hike back took until after nightfall. The next morning, they brought it to the Sugar Lands Ranger Station. The man at the front desk was tall and weathered, his gray uniform pressed, his eyes tired but sharply alert. His name tag read Ash.Ben. Set the backpack down on the counter. "Found this yesterday," he said, "up near Black Hollow Crag. About 6 miles past the closest trail marker." Ranger Ash's eyes flicked from them to the pack. For a long time he said nothing. Then he reached out, ran his fingers lightly over the frayed strap. His face hardened in a way neither of them could quite read. He turned wordlessly and sat at his computer, typing fast. It took only a few seconds before he found what he was looking for. A photograph. A man's smiling face framed by a green beanie and mirrored sunglasses. The sun gleamed in the canopy behind him. On his back, bright, unmistakable, vibrant red, the same carrier. Ash looked up. "Where exactly did you find this?" Ben gave him the GPS, coordinates. Ash stood, and everything changed. The return of the red backpack hit the Smoky Mountains law enforcement network like a lightning strike. Ranger Ash, once resigned to the closure of a cold case, found himself at the center of a revived operation. The backpack was not just a clue, it was a timeline fracture. A piece of evidence that appended every assumption they had made about what happened to Kaido and Luna Tanaka 5 years ago. The pack was logged, tagged, and sent to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's forensic lab in Knoxville. The case was reclassified from inactive to open under investigation at the lab. The backpack was handed over to Dr. Grace Vance, a forensic anthropologist and materials scientist known for her deep dive approach to long-term exposure analysis. She didn't just analyze what had happened, she focused on when it had happened, and how long an object had been where it was found. Her team began an exhaustive deconstruction. They took samples from the fabric, checked tensile strength on the stitching, tested the zippers, analyzed the soil and plant matter caught in its seams. Spectroscopic analysis of the dye showed the red nylon hadn't suffered the kind of UV degradation one would expect after 5 years of sun exposure. Instead, it looked, relatively speaking, new. That made no sense if it had been in that crevice for half a decade. Should have looked like it had spent time on the surface of Mars, bleached, brittle, fragile, but it didn't. The foam inside. The straps was another tell. It was dry, clean, no mold, no insect damage, no evidence of waterlogging. It hadn't been exposed to the freeze-thaw cycle common in the mountains, and it hadn't soaked in rain for years. At most, it had been exposed to the elements for a few months, which led to only one conclusion. The backpack had not been in that crevice for 5 years. Someone or something had placed it there. Recently, that revelation hit Ranger Ash like a punch to the chest, because if the backpack hadn't been there all that time, where had it been? The idea that Kaido had stashed it somewhere safe, and it had recently been dislodged, seemed possible, except Kaido was missing. Presumed dead. If he had died, the backpack would have stayed with him. That had been the working theory for 5 years, but now they had to consider the unthinkable. Had someone else taken the backpack? Had it been stored? Had someone hidden it? The scientists at the National Weather Service joined the conversation. Dr. Lauren DeWitt, a hydrologist specializing in Appalachian stormwater movement, began an analysis of weather patterns over the previous 6 months. She found a potential culprit. 4 months earlier, a freak thunderstorm system had stalled over the park's upper elevations, dumping nearly 8 inches of rain in less than 3 hours. It had triggered flash floods in several high-altitude zones, rare, violent events that reshaped creek beds and washed out small footbridges. A flash flood could, in theory, dislodge a hidden object, say, from inside a protected cave or under a rock legend, carry it miles down a natural drainage path. If the carrier had been wedged somewhere high and dry, and if that place had flooded suddenly, then maybe the pack had traveled on water. Was a radical theory, but it fit the evidence. Ash gathered his team and shifted the focus of the investigation. They would no longer think like searchers. They would think like water. Backtrack the likely path the backpack might have traveled. Reconstruct the storm. Follow the current upstream, piece by piece. The computer simulations began. LiDAR data was overlaid on topographical maps. Flow vectors were calculated. Every known tributary that fed the boulder field, where the backpack was found, was modeled and simulated for high-flow conditions. One path emerged as statistically likely: a long, narrow ravine branching off from a seldom-mapped feature known locally as Widow's Grief Basin. The name wasn't on park signage, but the rangers knew it. It was the kind of place stories clung to: sheer walls, deep shadows, no marked trails. A geological tangle of mossy granite and deep ledges, and in 2018, during the original search, it had been dismissed as implausible. Too far off Keto's planned route. It's too hostile for a man with a baby. But now it was the place the water came from. The backpack had been carried from somewhere in Widow's Grief. That meant one thing: someone had been there with it, and they might still be. The sun hadn't touched the forest floor in days. Widow's Grief Basin was the kind of place light didn't reach. A labyrinth of slick granite shelves, its overgrown rhododendron, and vertical ravines carved by water older than memory. The vegetation here didn't rustle so much as press, a constant thicket that pushed back against movement. The ground, when it appeared at all, was sponge soft with decay, and the air carried the smell of mold, stone, and forgotten places. Ranger Valerius Ash stepped carefully, his boot landing on a moss-free patch of rock no larger than a handprint. He looked up, gauging the grade of the slope above. Even now, after nearly 3 decades in this park, he felt that tightening in the gut. Widow's Grief didn't like visitors. Behind him, 5 others moved in practiced silence. A small, hand-picked team, 2 elite climbers from NPS Technical Rescue, a wilderness medic, a tracker from the Cherokee National Forest, and a hydrologist named Eve Salgado, the scientist who had helped reconstruct the flash flood path. This wasn't a traditional search party. It was a recovery expedition. Informed by simulation and science, guided by the whisper of moving water and the evidence of a backpack that should never have surfaced, their objective was clear: find the origin. Where had the pack waited for 5 years? Where had it been hidden, protected, until a storm freak and furious had ripped it from concealment and thrown it downslope like a broken secret? The team had left base at dawn. By mid-morning, they were already well past the point where any known trail could help them. The slope steepened. The canopy thickened. The light dimmed. Ash moved with the instinct of someone who didn't just know. The park, he belonged to it. Steps were deliberate, eyes scanning not the open ground, but the subtle places, under overhangs, behind fissures. Inside clefts where the earth pulled back like a wound, Eve paused at a small outcrop, crouched, and ran her fingers along a line of dislodged stone. "Water moved through here," she said quietly, "hard and fast. Maybe 4 months ago, but this didn't carry it." The backpack came from higher. She stood, pointing uphill. "Followed the wash line." Ash nodded. They moved on. The group pressed upward. By early afternoon, the soundscape changed. Here, in the higher reaches of the basin, the usual forest noises, birds, insects, leaves, were muffled. It was quieter, not silent exactly, but dampened, as if the rocks were absorbing sound. The tracker, a wiry man named Leo with keen eyes and a permanent squint, pointed toward a ledge above. "You're going to want to see this." Ash climbed up, hand over hand, and emerged onto a natural rock shelf. It was just wide enough to stand on. Above him, the stone rose in a sheer cliff. Against the base of that cliff was a wall of rhododendron, so dense it looked solid. But Leo wasn't pointing at the foliage. He was pointing at a dark shadow just beyond it. Ash pushed through. The space opened up abruptly. A natural recess about 15 feet deep, 20 wide, 4 feet high at the mouth. A rock shelter, dry, hidden, invisible unless you knew where to look or stumbled upon it by accident. Ash's stomach turned over once. This was it. He crouched and stepped inside. The air was cool, still. It smelled of dust and stone and something subtler. Aged, it took a moment for his eyes to adjust. Then he saw it in the far back corner. Beneath a gentle overhang of granite lay the skeletal remains of a man. He was curled on his side, legs drawn, and slightly, one arm outstretched, as though reaching for something. The bones were bleached but intact, clothing remnants faded to thread. Nearby, a rusted metal frame lay collapsed, the ghost of a hiker's internal frame pack. Whatever fabric had once clung to it had long since been consumed by moisture and time. The medic moved in quietly. He knelt beside the remains, his gloved hands careful, reverent. "Massive fractures to the femur and pelvis," he said after a moment. "Likely from a significant fall."
Ow.
"No signs of animal predation. This wasn't a violent death. He crawled in here, laid down, waiting to die," Ash said softly. The team was silent. None of them had to say it aloud. Kaido Tanaka had been found. 5 years of theories, half-truths, and whisper campaigns, and digital cold case chatter dissolved in that moment. The man had not disappeared into myth. He had fallen, and with the last of his strength, he had found a place to shelter his daughter. But the shelter was empty now. There was no child. No red baby carrier, only Kido. Ash exhaled, stood slowly, and turned his gaze toward the dark mouth of the shelter. They began a slow, methodical sweep. No clothing scraps, no toys, no sign of Luna. But then, as one of the forensics techs scraped gently along the dirt near the entrance, he struck something solid. It wasn't stone. He cleared it carefully, slowly. Brushing back the soil, it was a tool. Metal, rusted, a small hand-forged hoe, distinctive curved blade. The handle wrapped in green electrical tape, meticulously wound. Symmetrical a style, Ash recognized with a creeping chill. Not from Kaido, from someone else. He stared at the tool, his mind spinning. It was a Sangho digging tool, used by ginseng. Poachers. Illegal. Old world. Rare. And it should not have been there. Ash crouched beside it. Picked it up. Ran his fingers over the tape. Years ago, he had confiscated a tool just like this. Same build. Same green wrap. From a couple locals, not dangerous, but persistent. Always in the wrong places. It's always carrying the wrong tools. There. Names came back to him in a flash of memory. Quentin and Isola Mayfair. They'd never been arrested, never caught with actual roots in hand, but they'd been warned, watched, known, and now a Sangho one. Of theirs was buried in the shelter, where Kaido had died, which meant only one thing. Kaido had not died alone. That changed. Everything. Ash flew back to the ranger station that evening and pulled files from storage dusty manila folders from 2016 and 2017. Ginseng citations. Photos of confiscated gear. In one of them, a rusted pack, a water bottle, Dasangho with a handle wrapped in green electrical tape in a very specific pattern. He stared at it, heart pounding. The same wrap, the same tool. The file listed Quentin and Asula Mayfair's last known address, a rented cabin just outside Cosby, Tennessee. The record showed they'd vacated in spring 2019, 6 months after Kaido and Luna vanished. No forwarding address. Ash made some calls. A search of DMV and utility records showed a trail. The Mayfairs had moved first to West Virginia, then, strangely, a rural part of eastern Kentucky, off-grid, nearly sparse phone usage. No employment records, but something else had surfaced. A social services flag. They'd registered a daughter for homeschooling 2 years ago. Girl, now 6 years old, no birth certificate on file, no vaccination record, no doctor's visits, just they're living. Ash called in the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. This was no longer a wilderness accident. It was something else, something worse. 2 weeks later, Ash stood in front of a small, weather-beaten house at the end of a dirt road in Harlan County, Kentucky. He was flanked by 2 plainclothes TBI agents. Inside that house lived a couple who had once roamed the Smokies with illegal tools and a knack for vanishing into shadows. And possibly a little girl. A girl who, the impossible was. True had vanished into the forest with her father 5 years earlier. Ash held the final piece in his hand, a sealed evidence bag. Inside it, wrapped in fading green tape, was the Sang-Ho. He knocked on the door. A pause. A face at the window. Then a man answered. It was Quentin Mayfair. Thin, older eyes, sunken. He said nothing until Ash raised the evidence bag. When he saw the tape, the change in him was instant. A halt escaped his throat. A croak behind. Himisula appeared, her face crumpled, and somewhere in the back of the house, a child's voice called out, curious and small. "Mom?" Ash took a step forward. "We need to talk," he said. The silence in the room was neither awkward nor accidental. It was taut, held together by a shared understanding that what came next would crack something open and there would be no putting it back. Ranger. Valerius Ash stood just inside the Mayfairs. Living room, the Sang-Ho, still in its evidence bag on the coffee table between them. The little house in rural Kentucky was clean but old. Carpet sun-faded, the walls bearing the faint musk of wood smoke and time. A pair of children's boots sat neatly by the back door. Pink, worn, a size far too small to be coincidence. Across, from him, Quentin Mayfair sat hunched forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped tightly, knuckles pale. Zula sat beside him, unmoving. Her fingers curled into the hem of her sweater as if trying to hold herself in place. The TBI agents kept their distance. No handcuffs, no voices raised. That wasn't the point. They weren't here to accuse. They were here to ask. Ash began softly. "We know you were in Widow's Grief Basin in early October 2018. The Sang-Ho puts you there. That rock shelter, Kaido. Tanaka died there, alone. Or so we thought." Asala's eyes brimmed suddenly, but she didn't look away. Quentin stayed rigid, silent. Ash leaned forward. "There's a child. You call her Annabeth. She's about 6. Looks like Luna Tanaka. Same dark hair, same eyes. You haven't taken her to a doctor? You haven't enrolled her in school? No one's seen her outside this county." He paused. "Let the weight of it settle, then. We need to know the truth. All of it. What happened in that shelter?" Broke first. Her voice came not in a confession, but in a sob. Quentin closed his eyes, exhaled, and slowly nodded. Like a man at the gallows who'd stopped hoping for reprieve, and the story came. They had been poaching. They didn't lie about that. It had been a good patch of ginseng-deep veins under the leaf rot. Older roots that would have fetched them enough to keep the power on through the winter. They'd hiked in before dawn, gone quiet and deep. They weren't supposed to be that far south. and definitely not that high up in widow's grief. But Quentin had found a ridge once years ago and marked it on memory alone. A secret place. Like all poachers, they trusted memory more than maps. They were packing up to leave when they heard the cry. It was faint. It's not an animal. Human. Weak. They thought it was a child at first, and a man. Then both. They found Kaido lying at the base of a small drop-off, twisted sideways, a bad angle in the hips. Leg bent so far it touched the ground wrong. His pack was beside him, torn open. The red baby carrier lay in the dirt. And inside, wrapped in a fleece blanket and his own jacket, was Luna. She was crying, but not injured. Cold, hungry, but whole. Kaido could barely speak. His eyes flicked open and shut, voice slurred and urgent. They hadn't understood at first something about the trail, about falling, about saving her. He pushed the baby toward them. Didn't ask for help. Didn't ask for rescue, Lee said. One thing, again and again. Save her, please. Take her. They did. Because they panicked. Because they were there illegally. And they knew that poachers found near a dead man were never believed. Because Kaido had been dying and had begged them to take her. Because there was something cosmic about it. Tazula had felt it even then. This wasn't just a child. This was a child given. Entrusted. They left Kaido with their water, tucked the baby in the red carrier and fled. They'd planned to drop her off anonymously. A hospital, a church, somewhere safe. But Luna never cried. On the drive, she just watched them with those wide, solemn eyes. And somehow, they didn't stop. A week passed, then two. She learned to say mama. They changed her name, told themselves it was a kindness, and began the second half of their lives with a lie so big. It began to feel like truth. When the confession ended, no one spoke for a full minute. Ash's voice, when it came, was flat. You left a man to die. Quentin didn't flinch. He was already dying. That wasn't your call. No. Sir, it wasn't. But it was all we had. One of the TBI agents stood, then stepped into the hallway. In the back bedroom, a little girl sat on a pink blanket surrounded by puzzles and old books. She looked up. The agent knelt. Hey, she said gently. I'm going to hang out with you for a little while, okay? Your mom and dad just have to talk to some grown-ups for a bit. Luna-Annabeth- nodded slowly. She was shy. She didn't cry. Her life had been quiet, rural, gentle. A kind of safe. Even if the foundation had been built on something stolen, she did not know the name Kaido Tanaka. She did not remember the forest. The DNA results came. 2 days later, a perfect match. Luna Tanaka had been found alive. The call came. To Akari Tanaka on a Tuesday morning. She was at her drafting table. Halfway through a mock-up for a Greenway redesign in Asheville, the phone rang. She knew before she answered. Some primal chord in her gut tightened. The voice on the other. End was measured, practiced. They told her they had confirmed Kaido's remains had been recovered. A moment of silence followed. Then, in Akari, they also found Luna. There was no scream, no gasp, no weeping. Only the sound of a pencil rolling off her table and hitting the floor. The reunion was delicate. Luna was 6. She didn't recognize. The woman who stood behind the two-way mirror at the Child Protective Services facility, hands trembling, eyes full. She had grown up believing her name was Annabeth, believing her parents were the Mayfairs, believing that the old pictures in the photo album, the ones that only dated back to 2019, were all that life had ever been. The social workers moved gently. Akari was introduced as a friend at first, then a helper. Then, slowly, as something more, there would be therapy, counseling, reintroduction protocols. The law would move, but slowly. Because trauma was not a switch that could be flipped, and for Akari, this wasn't the fairy tale ending she had dreamed of. This was a new story, one with its own uncertainties, one where love would have to be rebuilt, not just rediscovered. She would not get back the years, but she had her daughter. And in the face of everything else, that was enough. Quentin and Asula Mayfair were taken into custody. The charges were complex. They Hadn't killed Kaido, hadn't kidnapped Luna in the traditional sense, but they had failed to render aid. Had removed a child from a fatal scene, had lied to authorities, built a life on someone else's pain. Their lawyer would argue their actions came from panic, not malice, that they had raised Luna well, that they had done what Kaido asked. But, in the end, the law was less interested in why than in what. They were sentenced to 7 years. Luna was placed under Akari's custody. The Mayfairs never fought it. When Asilla was led away in handcuffs, she looked back only once, and what she saw was not condemnation. It was holding the hand of the little girl who had once called her mama, and saying softly, "It's okay now, you're safe." But even as the case was closed, Ranger, Ash couldn't shake one thing, a single unanswered thread that gnawed at him. Like a tick behind the ear. If the backpack had been stored somewhere safe for years, where? And if it had been dislodged by a flood only recently, what else might still be out there? Smokies had given up their secret. But they had not given up all of them. And Ash had learned, painfully, that when a mountain is quiet for too long, it's not resting, it's waiting. The search was over, but the silence it left behind was not peace. After Luna's recovery and the Mayfair's arrest, the headlines died down. Journalists packed away their cameras. The podcasters wrapped up their final analysis episodes. YouTubers posted their deep dive retrospectives with somber piano tracks. And the world moved on. But in the Smoky Mountains, where moss creeps and fog drags itself across the ridgelines like a wounded animal, some stories linger like damp rot beneath the bark. And Ranger Valerius Ash, after 30 years of chasing shadows through stone and brush, knew better than to mistake a solved case for a finished one, because questions still itched at the edges of the Tanaka file. Where had the red carrier been? Kept for 5 years? Where had Kaido stashed his child? And had some third party found her first? The Mayfairs swore that when they found Kaido, he had Luna with him. That she had been strapped into the carrier, wrapped in his coat, crying but unhurt. Their story had been consistent, airtight. But Ash couldn't forget one detail. The carrier itself had no signs of long-term exposure, according to the forensic report. Hadn't weathered even a single winter, which meant the pack-end by implication. Luna hadn't stayed in that rock shelter the whole time. It meant Kaido had moved her, and that meant he'd been stronger, longer, than anyone had guessed. He hadn't just dragged himself into the shelter and died. He'd tried something. Ash couldn't let that go. Winter came early that year. By mid-November, hoarfrost painted the ridge trails, and the hollows breathed mist like sleepwalking giants. Ash waited until the snow dusted the peaks before he packed his ruck and returned to Widow's Grief. He went alone, not to retrace the search he already knew where. Kaido had died, but to find what Kaido might have used before that, because something had protected Luna, something had kept her dry, safe, whole. And the mountains didn't offer that kind of mercy unless someone made it. Ash hiked in, under slate-gray skies. His bones complained, his knees barked, but he ignored them. Age was a toll, not a wall. He reached the shelter by dusk. The rocks still bore signs of disturbance, flagging tape from the forensic team, boot tracks hardened into the damp soil. But Ash didn't stop there. He began moving uphill. The logic was simple. If Kaido fell and crawled into the shelter, then he and Luna had come from above, somewhere upslope. A moment before catastrophe, Kaido had left something behind, a clue, a trail, or a hiding place. Ash combed the slope slowly. Methodically 2 days passed. Snow flurried once, then vanished. On the third morning, he found it. It wasn't dramatic, a shallow dip in the hillside. Nearly invisible unless you were walking exactly the wrong way. A low shelf of stone with a narrow overhang. Partly hidden by brambles and a fallen log, Ash pushed through and ducked inside at first. He saw nothing. Then, in the far back corner, his headlamp caught it. The remains of a small makeshift lean-to. Rotten branches lashed together with paracord, a nest of old, mildewed fabric. the frame of a thermal blanket blackened by mildew. Someone had made a shelter here, a temporary one, and, tucked beneath the layers, Ash found a small stack of supplies, juice pouches, dried apples, crumbled graham crackers in a Ziploc, all degraded, all at least 5 years old, and something else. The plastic baby spoon, still faintly pink. The truth crashed into Ash, like a heartbeat in the chest. This had been Luna's first refuge. Before the fall, before Kaido's leg shattered and time ran out. He had stashed her here, safe, sheltered, fed, and then he'd fallen, or been pushed. Ash sat back against the stone and let the cold seep into him. It changed nothing legally, but it changed everything about the story. Kaido hadn't died helpless. He had fought strategically, savagely to give his daughter a chance, and he had almost succeeded. Akari Tanaka stood in her kitchen, watching Luna through the window. The child was quiet, cautious, not withdrawn exactly, but careful with joy, as if she didn't trust it yet. She loved puzzles. She disliked loud noises. She didn't remember the forest, but sometimes her eyes flicked upward at trees like they were familiar strangers. The therapist said attachment would take time, so would trust. Some memories were gone. Others were buried under names like Annabeth and phrases like just visiting. But one night, just before Christmas, Luna had come into her mother's room clutching a blanket. She climbed into bed and whispered, "Tell me again." Kari didn't ask what she meant. She knew. She told her the story of a man who loved the mountains and loved his daughter even more. She told her about a red backpack and a picture on a phone and a promise made in the trees. She told her about a beetle on a leaf and the way a father had once said, "The mountains are showing off today. Love you." Luna didn't cry. She just whispered, "I think I remember his voice." In the park office, Ranger Ash closed the file for the last time. It would stay in the cabinet, of course. Records did, but the case was done. He'd written his final report in longhand, signed it, and placed it on top of the stack. A new ranger, young one, full of fire and theory, had read the file cover to cover and asked Ash a question over coffee. I think there was someone else up there? Before the Mayfairs?" Ash sipped. Then looked out the window at the rain drizzling down the glass. "There's always someone else in these mountains," he said. "Just depends how far you're willing to look." The young ranger nodded. "And do you think Kaido knew they were coming?" "The Mayfairs?" Ash didn't answer for a long time. Then quietly, "I think he knew someone would come, just didn't know who." Miles away, far off any trail, something glittered in the frost-choked leaves. Whistle, plastic orange, the kind that clipped to a baby's jacket zipper. It lay where it had fallen 5 years ago, overlooked by the search mist, by the weather. Buried until a winter breeze pushed aside a single pine needle. The forest said nothing. It didn't have to. It just waited. Spring in the Smokies doesn't arrive like a guest. Floods in feral, impatient, full of mud and thawed grief. By late March, meltwater braided through creek beds. Wild trillium pressed up from the soft loam, and the ridgelines exhaled the fog they'd hoarded all winter. Ranger Valerius Ash stood at the edge of Little Crow Hollow, watching runoff twist between sycamore roots like veins under a pale skin. He was supposed to be on light-duty paperwork, orientations, radio checks, but the Tanaka case had changed something in him. Closed or not, it still scratched like brambles under his sleeve. It wasn't just the mystery anymore, it was what the mystery had left behind in Knoxville. Akari Tanaka sat in a therapist's waiting room beside her daughter. Luna's feet dangled off the bench. She had drawn a quiet constellation of stars on the back of her hand with blue marker. Her hair was longer now, her posture taller, but she still flinched at sudden motion and didn't like it when people whispered behind closed doors. The court had moved fast. Full parental custody was restored. Luna's identity had been legally reestablished. But reintegration wasn't paperwork, it was a process. She still called Akari mommy, only when she forgot not to. Progress came in inches that week. Luna had spoken about the woods without fear, She described the cave house where she'd once slept with her first daddy, and how she used to count the green rocks around the edge of their secret Akari, and wept quietly in the car after. She knew what that meant, Luna remembered. The first shelter. The real first one. Not the Mayfairs, not the court transcripts, but the secret lean-to Kaido had built before his body broke. And if Luna remembered that, what else might be waiting in the dark? Ash returned to Widow's Grief in April. He didn't tell anyone, just signed out a vehicle, packed 3 days' supplies, and left a note with the dispatch desk. Recon trip, same zone. There was no protocol for the kind of itch he had in no column. On the incident form for unfinished business, but Ash had learned to listen to the subtle tension of unsaid things. He followed the storm. Path again, not the flood trail that had disgorged the carrier, but the one Luna had once likely traveled on foot. He wasn't looking for evidence. Anymore, he was looking for possibility. On the second day, he found the chimney stone. It was buried in shadow at the base of a narrow ravine, almost entirely swallowed by ground cover. Ivy clung to the upper flanks like fingers. Behind it, the forest thickened sharply into a stand of old-growth tulip poplar and mountain. Ash, but the stone itself was cut, rectilinear, tool-marked, stacked with intention, not new, not natural. Ash crouched, pulled back the undergrowth, and uncovered what was unmistakably a collapsed hearth, the remains of a small primitive cabin, long ruined. The structure was gone, the walls devoured by time. But the outline was still there, a foundation ridge, a flattened ring of stones, and fragments of rotted beam, a pioneer cabin maybe, or something older. These ruins dotted the Smokies like forgotten. Punctuation marks, shelters from another age, claimed by moss and memory. Most weren't mapped. Some weren't even known. Ash moved through the site slowly, deliberately. Near the hearth, he found a rusted hinge. Part of a door, maybe. Further in, a glass shard from an old lantern. But what stopped him was the carving near the base of one of the buried wall stones. Someone had etched 3 letters in shallow, firm strokes. LTK. Ash ran his thumb across. The grooves. Luna Tanaka Kaido. Or maybe Luna Tanaka Kaido. Either way. It was real. This had been a place, a waypoint, a decision, and Kaido wounded, or not, had brought his daughter here. The shelter in the rock face wasn't the beginning. It was the end. That night, Ash made camp on a dry patch beneath the tallest of the poplars. The fire was small, barely more than coals. In the silence, the woods settled around him like a closing eye. He lay back and stared at the canopy. And for the first time since Luna had been found, he allowed himself to wonder something deeper. What had really happened out here? Just the timeline, not just the facts, but the truth. Because Kaido had died of injuries sustained in a fall. But why had he fallen? The Mayfairs had claimed they found him already injured, but their timing had always been suspicious, too precise, too convenient. And then there was the matter of the Sang-ho dropped, left behind. So, unlike Quentin's usual meticulousness, what? If it hadn't been dropped, what if it had been used for leverage, not digging? Ash sat up suddenly, the thought stabbing through him like a broken rib. A man with a child, hiding in an illegal camp, in possession of valuable wild ginseng, and someone else comes along. Poachers, desperate, nervous. One man, one child, the secret that could ruin them all. What if there had been a confrontation? What if Kaido hadn't simply fallen? What if he'd been pushed? He didn't sleep that night. In Tennessee, Akari received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Luna at about a year old, asleep in the red carrier, her face half-shadowed beneath a floppy sun hat. The photo was crisp, taken from behind. At a distance, not one of Kaido's, not one she'd ever seen. On the back, written in thick black marker, were 3 words. You weren't wrong. Akari called Ash immediately. He listened in silence, then said, "Only send me the envelope." She did. Within 2 days, it was in the TBI lab. They found no prints, no DNA, no postmark. but the paper was faded in a way. It suggested it was at least 5 years old. It had been kept preserved. Somebody out there still had photos of Luna. Ash sat with the envelope under his desk lamp long after hours, staring at the handwriting. It was crude. All caps. Blocky. But the slant, it was familiar, from an old citation record, filed under a different case. A poacher known only by alias. Red Mica. A loner, rarely seen. Never caught with product. But always nearby when others disappeared. Ash pulled the old sketch. Weathered face. Heavy beard. Scars along the temple from a long-ago bear trap accident. Eyes like black stone. Last seen, October 2018. Near widow's grief, Ash picked up the phone. Reopened the Mayfair transcript. He told the TBI liaison, "I think we missed something. Somewhere deep in the Smokies, a fire crackled under a ledge of stone. A man sat hunched beside it, scraping something with a blade, maybe bark, maybe thyme, in the flickering light. The edge of an old photograph poked from a metal tin. A baby girl in a sun hat, a father's hand in the frame. The man looked at it for a long time, then placed it back. Gently, he had not meant to kill Kaito Tanaka, but things get strange in the mountains, and sometimes you think a child might be better off if her past never found her again. The Mayfairs hadn't been his plan, but they'd done the job. Now they were gone. And the story, his part of it, was just ashes and memory. The fire cracked again, and somewhere, far away, a little girl dreamed of stars painted on skin, and a man she only sometimes remembered, whose voice always said, 'Love you.' There's a silence in the Smoky Mountains that doesn't belong to the wind. It settles in the soil like a kept secret, gathers between ridge lines and beneath the bark of old trees where lichen spreads slow and indifferent. It doesn't announce itself. It waits." Ranger Valerius Ash was beginning to think that kind of silence wasn't passive. It was protective, and he'd just disturbed it. The photograph had changed everything. The moment Akari sent it, Ash knew the case wasn't done. Not in spirit, not in consequence. A 5-year-old picture of Luna 1 never before seen. Taken from a distance, preserved and mailed in secret, could mean only one thing. Someone else had been watching, not just during Kaito's last days, but since at TBI headquarters in Nashville. Agent Nia Wolf reopened the Red Mica file at Ash's request. She hadn't worked the original investigation. She was still in Quantico back then, but she'd read the Tanakh case twice since taking over missing persons in the Smoky region. Red Mica was a ghost with an Appalachian accent, real name unknown. No fingerprints on record. Multiple sightings dating back to 2003, always connected to illegal ginseng harvesting, occasional squatting, and once suspected fire that had consumed an outbuilding on federal land. But every time someone had tried to bring him in, he'd vanished. Locals said he knew the mountains better than the Park Service. They said he had once been a ranger. Himself, Wolf, didn't put much stock in folklore. But the photo, the undeniable. Physical presence of a third party that was evidence, and evidence didn't lie. Within 48 hours, she'd cross-referenced all Red Mica sightings with the October 2018 window. One stood out. October 4th, a backpacker named Gina. Odell had filed a casual report after seeing a strange man with a rifle near Chestnut Drop Trail. Her description matched, but no follow-up had been made at the time. Person calls too few rangers. Kaito and Luna had vanished the next day. Ash had missed it. He felt that failure-like weight behind his ribs in Knoxville. Akari sat with Luna in their shared therapist's office. The room was warm, painted, and soft. Hughes, the child therapist, Ms. Barlow, spoke in slow, careful tones. Luna drew pictures on the floor beside them, sometimes families, sometimes mountains, sometimes things that didn't make sense until Akari asked her. Today Luna drew a small red pack and a beetle, then, carefully, she drew 2 men. "One is Daddy," she said, "and the other?" Barlow asked gently. Luna paused. "He was there before the other, Mommy." Akari didn't breathe. Luna continued drawing. A third figure, now herself, held between the 2 men. She pointed at the second one. "He had a knife that folded. He gave me apple slices." Akari felt her stomach turn to ice. Wolf would later have the sketch analyzed. Luna's description was vague and inappropriate, filtered through a child's imperfect lens, but it was too specific to ignore, especially the knife. Red. Micah was known to carry a folding buck 110, a classic. Heavy-handled blade favored by older woodsmen and poachers. No one had mentioned it to Luna, but she remembered it. Ash. Wolf and a team of federal agents returned to Widow's Grief Basin with fresh coordinates. This time, looking not for a body, but for a man still out there. They approached the ruin Ash had found earlier, the chimney stones, and collapsed cabin, and expanded their search outward, setting up trail cams, laying low-profile motion sensors. Scanning the earth with infrared drones, they found signs, footprints. Not fresh, but recent enough to read. A small fire, pit cold, but used within the last month. And under a rock 100 yards from the ruins, a cache of tools wrapped in canvas, inside, to Sang Hosea. A lockpick set, a compass missing its glass, and a bundle of photographs. Most were of forest trees, trails, creek beds, but several were of people. Hikers, rangers, and in the center of the pack. Luna and Kaido, taken at a distance, no one had even known those photos existed. Ash stood in the woods that evening as the light failed and looked out over Widow's Grief. Was radio silent. "You followed them," he said aloud to no one. "Did you help them?" He didn't expect an answer, but part of him believed Red Micah had never meant to harm Kaido, that he had simply been there, an observer of a man on the edge. A witness to a moment when survival wasn't clean or heroic, but messy, frantic, human. Maybe Micah had helped Luna after Kaido fell. Maybe he'd led the Mayfairs to the shelter, then disappeared before they saw him. Maybe he'd kept the child alive, fed her, warmed her, and handed her off when the law got too close. He wasn't a villain, but he wasn't a hero either. The FBI classified him now as a person of interest. In at least 3 open cases, including the Tanaka disappearance, a warrant was issued, but they knew he wouldn't be caught like that. He was Myth. And Myth didn't come to court. That week, a trail cam south of the Tremont region picked up an image, blurry, night shot, grainy green, a man in a patched jacket, beard down to his collarbone, carrying a canvas satchel and a walking staff carved with KNOTWORK. No way to confirm identity, but Ash knew. So did Wolf. They released no public statement, no press conference. Only a single internal memo. Subject remains at large. No known address. Avoid direct contact. Possibly armed. Possibly protective in the mountains. A girl lived with her mother again. She still had dreams of stone walls and sheltering arms, and sometimes she spoke aloud to the trees as if someone were listening, far above the trails, under a rock ledge. Overlooking a hidden bend in the little river, a man sat alone, eating dried apples and watching stars blink through the leaves. He pulled an envelope from his satchel. Inside was a photo creased worn, a man in a green beanie and a baby on his back. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. The Smokies had changed, not in the way of terrain or seasons. That cycle was ancient and eternal, but in how they were watched. Since the rediscovery of Luna Tanaka, the park had become quieter in a way that didn't feel natural. Rangers noticed it first. Less chatter on the back channels. Fewer illegal camps. Poachers, once a nuisance, had scattered like birds before a storm. Something had shifted, and Ash knew exactly why. Red Micah was still out there. The photograph had proven it. The fire pits, the cache of tools, the trail. Cam glimpses, blurry and loris, but unmistakable, proved. He wasn't a ghost, but finding him was like chasing smoke. Wolf's team from the TBI had plotted 100 possible routes, built topographical models, and even interviewed old-timers. Who remembered stories of a man who moved like a rumor and vanished like fog? Nothing stuck. But Ash was done with models. He wanted to go backward, to retrace not where Red Micah might go, but where he'd already been. That meant asking a question he had avoided for 6 months. What happened in the hours between Kaido's fall and the Mayfair's arrival? because someone had kept Luna alive in that window, and didn't think it had been the mountain. He started with the raw data Kaido's last message at 10:32 a.m. The Mayfair's alleged arrival near dusk. The time gap, 6 to 8 hours. Luna, at 14 months, couldn't feed herself, couldn't crawl far, could barely walk. She would have cried, screamed, panicked, and yet when the Mayfairs found her, she was quiet, warm, fed someone had calmed her. Ash went back to the forensic photos. The red baby carrier had contained not just formula and diapers, but half a peeled apple, brown by oxidation. The plastic spoon was clean, wiped, and none of it showed. Kaido's prints, there had been another set of hands. He made a call to Akari. Luna ever mention anyone else in the shelter? Not the Mayfairs before them? Pause. Then quietly, she calls him the quiet man. Ash's throat tightened. She says he never talked, just smiled, showed her a beetle on a stick, and gave her honey from a jar. Ash closed his eyes. That was enough. With Wolf's approval, Ash began to build a psychological profile not of Red Micah as a criminal, but as a caretaker. What kind of man risked exposure to help a dying father and his child? What did he want? Micah had no history of violence, no extortion, no notes left at crime scenes. He wasn't playing a game, if anything. He had gone to great lengths to avoid being part of the story, except for the photo, the one he'd mailed. You weren't wrong. That wasn't a taunt. It was a confession. Ash returned to the rock shelter one. Last time, he wasn't alone this time. Luna came with him. She was nearly 7 now, quieter, thoughtful in a way that didn't always match her age. She carried a sketchbook. Akari had given her permission. She trusted Ash, and she wanted her daughter to have agency too. Remember, on her terms, Luna walked the trail without fear. When they reached the shelter, she stopped just at the threshold. This is where he was, she said, pointing. Your dad. She shook her head. The other one. Ash knelt. The quiet man? She nodded. He sat right there, she said, pointing to a flat stone. He gave me water in a blue cup. I didn't cry. I was tired, but he said, it's okay, little star. Ash blinked. He spoke to you. Luna smiled faintly. Once. That night, Ash reviewed every incident report from the park dating back to decades. Only one other case had mentioned that phrase. It's okay, little star. It had been logged in 2011. A lost camper reported hearing a voice at night, calming and low, calling to her, sleep, little star. Mornings close. She'd followed the voice and been found by rangers the next day. Curled up beneath a pine at the edge of a ranger trail, unharmed. The rangers had written it off as trauma-fueled hallucination, but Ash didn't believe that. Anymore, somewhere in the Smokies, a man moved between shadows. He didn't write journals, didn't keep trophies, but he remembered the girl and the father with the shattered leg who had looked up at him with a face full of tears and said, please, don't let her die in the dark. He'd stayed. He'd waited until the couple came, though. Ones who didn't look like killers, just scared people in the wrong place. He'd watched them take the child, and he hadn't followed, because sometimes the only gift left to give was silence. 1 week later, Luna received a package. No return. Address. Inside, a jar of mountain honey, a beetle carved from walnut wood, and a small note, you are not forgotten. The quiet is watching. Akari found her in the living room that night, staring out the window toward the tree line. I'm okay, Mommy, she said. He doesn't want to hurt us. Akari wrapped her arms around her daughter and held her long, past bedtime. Outside, the wind moved through the branches. Not hostile, just there. Ash didn't try to track Red Micah again. He closed the last file. Not because the case was solved, but because some stories end with breath, not closure, and some ghosts walk the woods not to haunt, but to protect. The fog came early that May, pressing against the Smokies like a hand over a mouth. It didn't roll in so much as seep, sliding between tree trunks and settling low over the forest floor like breath held. Too long. Ranger Valerius Ash had seen fog before. He'd tracked in it, gotten turned around in it, once lost a trainee for 6 hours in a pocket so thick it felt like milk. But this was different. This was the kind of fog that makes radios crackle, GPS signals stutter, and seasoned hikers stop, moving not out of fear, but out of instinct. The park was quiet, too quiet down in Knoxville. Luna Tanaka turned 7. It was a small party. Stakari, her coworker Marta, 2 kids from homeschool group, and a chocolate cake shaped vaguely like a beetle. Luna had laughed at that, the first time in a way that didn't feel like it had to ask permission. Later that night, Kari found her daughter sitting cross-legged on the back porch, sketchbook in her lap. Sketchbook in her lap. She was drawing. A forest, but not any forest. This one had detail-specific ones. A chimney stack, a broken cabin wall, a notch in the hillside, and a figure standing at the edge, barefoot, bearded, watching, double quotes. "Is that your quiet man?" Akari asked, kneeling beside her. Luna nodded without looking up. "He lives there." "You've seen him again?" Luna hesitated. "Not with my eyes, but he's there. I feel him when it rains." Akari didn't press. She just wrapped her arm around Luna's shoulders and let the night settle around them like leaves. At Park HQ, Ash received a call from a wildlife survey team. They'd found something strange while mapping amphibian habitats along a tributary that fed into Little Crow Hollow, a grave, the young intern said. Not a modern one. Old. But not ancient either. Ash was up the ridge within 4 hours. The site was simple. Stones piled in a loose oval. No marker, no engraving, no bones exposed. Just the shape of a burial. The location. 20 minutes. South of the cabin ruin where Kaido had once kept Luna safe. Ash crouched beside it, brushing back moss inside the stone ring. Someone had left a child's mitten, red, weather-worn, and tucked inside the mitten, a sprig of sangwild ginseng, braided at the root. Ash didn't touch it, he just stared. The lab report would later confirm that the grave contained a single adult femur, fractured along the shaft. The damage was identical to Kaido's injury, and yet the DNA was not his. A second body, a second fall. From the same era, Ash pulled the Mayfair's original interview tapes and listened again. Quentin had said, "We thought we heard yelling." Then nothing. "We were scared to go closer. Never saw Kaido fall. They just found him after," which meant someone else had gone over that. Edge first. Ash contacted Wolf. "We're not looking at a one-man tragedy," he said. "We're looking at a collision." That night, Wolf unearthed an old missing persons report. October 3rd, 2018, one day before Kaido disappeared. A man named Derek Holcomb, unlicensed herbalist, known squatter, hadn't been reported missing until months later by a sister who assumed he was just off-grid. But his last known location? Widow's grief. Ash pulled the DMV photo. Holcomb had a beard, carried a heavy canvas satchel, favored walking sticks, and looked a hell of a lot like Red, Mika. But it didn't track. Mika had mailed the photo. Mika had watched from the trees. Mika had helped Luna. So if Holcomb was dead, then who was the man in the woods? In a remote pocket of the forest, far from any trail, a cave mouth yawned between 2 cliffs, barely a cleft. Hidden by rhododendron and thyme, inside a bedroll, a tin cup, collection of feathers arranged in concentric circles. An old radio, receiver shortwave, battery-powered, and taped to the inside wall. It's a single Polaroid, a picture of Kaido Tanaka, not smiling, just looking off to the side, as if hearing something. On the back, in handwriting that didn't match any file, he saw what I saw. That's why I stayed. Ash drove to Akari's house the next day. He didn't wear his uniform, didn't bring forms. Just a printout of the lab results and a folder of photos. Kaido, Luna, Holcomb, the burial site. He explained everything. Holcomb had likely been tracking ginseng illegally. He and Kaido may have encountered each other, whether as strangers or something more. A fight, maybe a fall. But Kaido didn't leave him to die. Kaido buried him, marked the grave, and then he went down to his own death. But not before ensuring Luna would be found. He didn't run, Ash said. He took responsibility for everything. Kari wept again, quietly. Not from grief, from pride. Luna drew that night until the paper ran out. She showed her mother the final sketch before bed. It was the forest. 2 men stood side by side. One had a beetle on his hand. The other had a red carrier on his back. They weren't smiling, but they weren't afraid. And behind them, a figure fading into trees. Long hair, bare feet, watching, always watching, somewhere deep in the park, as fog braided itself through the branches. A man walked with a quiet gait. He carried no phone, no ID, only a pouch of dried fruit, a compass that didn't point north, and a carved stick marked with a single star. He did not need to be seen. He only needed to remember, because memory was a kind of justice, and silence was a kind of truth. It began with a sound, not thunder, not wind, not the typical groan of trees swaying against old bark. This was lower, softer, like a breath drawn deep beneath the earth, rising slow and ancient. Akar Achanaka heard it first. On a morning in early August, Luna was in the backyard, tying yarn between fence posts to make what she called a catching maze for butterflies. Akari had stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, when the sound rolled low across the hills behind her house. Not quite natural. Not quite unnatural, just a sound that didn't belong to the living. That same morning, miles away, Ranger Valerius Ash stood at the edge of a shallow ravine above Widow's Grief Basin. He had climbed there before dawn. Not for duty, not even for closure, but for something else, something harder to name. The forest was thick with heat and green light, but beneath the noise, there was still that silence he couldn't shake. A listening quiet. He crouched beside the old ruin, what remained of Kaido's cabin, though only he called it that now. At the base of the hearth, someone had left a single object, a carved wooden beetle. Ash stared at it for a long time. Then he whispered, not to the forest, but to someone he wasn't sure would answer, "You're still here?" The leaves didn't move, but something in the air did. In Nashville, Agent Nia Wolf was finishing a field report when a package arrived with no return address. It contained a weather-stained field journal, 3 undeveloped 35mm rolls of film, a note handwritten in faded ink. "You've read the story backwards. Here's the rest." She developed the film that afternoon. It was grainy, uneven, but the pictures were unmistakable. Kaido crouched beside a small shelter, smiling weakly as Luna reached for him. Holcomb sitting upright, hand extended, not in threat, but in peace. And Red Miko wore, whoever the man truly was, taking the photo in a reflection off an old window, visible only in silhouette. There had been a moment, one brief alignment, when all 3 had coexisted. Not in conflict, in trust. Wolf sat back in her chair and stared at the prints, until the sun sank low. This wasn't just a case anymore. It had never been. It was a testament Luna Tanaka stood beneath, the biggest tree in her schoolyard that September, and gave a report on her hero. Other kids talked about doctors, firefighters, comic book characters. She spoke softly, but with clarity. "My hero is my first dad. He saved me when we were in the forest. He made me warm even when he was hurt. And he told me to look at the beetles because they were strong even when they were small." The teacher choked up. No one clapped. They just sat in silence for a full 10 seconds after she finished. Then Luna sat down and didn't smile, but she looked at the window and nodded, as if someone were outside, watching Ash retired quietly. The following spring, no ceremony, just a letter left on the bulletin board in the ranger station. 30 years. 26 recoveries, 7 that never came home. One child who did, he left his badge inside a compass case on the desk. The compass didn't point north anymore. But maybe that wasn't the point. 2 years later, hikers on an unmarked ridge near the northern boundary of the park discovered something unusual. A small cairn. Beneath it, a laminated note sealed in plastic. Let the ones who carry children be remembered. Let the ones who vanish for them not be forgotten. Not every ghost haunts. Some protect. No one claimed authorship. The forest did not offer explanation, only a pause, breath, and the stillness of watching. Akari took Luna back to the old trailhead when she turned 10. The rangers had cleared a new overlook above the basina. Safe, wide platform where visitors could see the forest stretching like a green sea toward the Tennessee sky. Luna walked to the edge. She carried the beetle carving in one hand, the sang-ho in the other. She didn't throw them, she just stood. "Want to say thank you," she said. "To your dad?" She nodded to both of them. Then she placed the carving gently on the edge of the wooden rail and turned away. The next morning, the beetle was gone. Not fallen. Gone. And in its place, a feather, black, tucked under a stone. There are stories that get solved. There are stories that end in courts or hospitals or graves. But the forest doesn't write its endings in ink. It writes them in bark, in wind, in the silence between raindrops. It hides its truths under lichen and loam. And if you stand still long enough, sometimes it shows you one.